Was it possible for a woman to travel 3,000 miles for love, only to find her groom already buried in the ground? The westbound train hissed into Cedar Ridge like an exhausted beast, coughing black smoke into the cold October sky. Margaret Sullivan stood on the platform steps, one gloved hand clutching a carpet bag, the other cradling a scruffy little dog against her chest. Her dress, once navy blue, was faded to the dull color of storm clouds, and dust clung to every fold. The long journey from Philadelphia had drained the color from her cheeks, but not the quiet dignity in her gray eyes. The town stared. They always did when the weekly train arrived, but today there was something special to whisper about: a mail-order bride. Mrs. Abigail Foster, the banker's wife, fanned herself with exaggerated interest. "Lord have mercy, is that the woman Thomas Morrison sent for?" Her friend Miss Prudence Wright leaned closer. "Can't be. Thomas said she was comely." The photograph he showed looked nothing like that. But it was her. The woman descending those iron steps was Margaret Sullivan, the would-be bride of Thomas Morrison. She had memorized his letters, each word full of kindness and promise. "Look for me in a brown hat with a red band," he had written. "I'll be waiting when your train pulls in." Now she stood in the chill wind, scanning the crowd. There was no tall man in a brown hat, no familiar smile from the letters. Only strangers watching her like she'd stepped off that train carrying trouble instead of hope. "Excuse me," she asked the station master, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Mr. Thomas Morrison, do you know where I might find him?" Jake Henderson hesitated. He looked at the ground, at the curious faces, then back at her with pity that made her stomach twist. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry. There was an accident. Horse threw him 5 days ago, out near Devil's Canyon. Broke his neck. We buried him Tuesday." The world tilted. Margaret gripped the railing as the platform spun around her. Someone pushed a wooden crate behind her so she could sit. The dog, Chester, let out a soft whine pressing against her chest. Dead. The man who'd written her letters. The man who'd promised her a home, a garden, a place to belong. Gone before she could even meet him. "Well," said Mrs. Foster loudly enough for everyone to hear, "what'll we do with her now? Send her back, I suppose." "Looks like she hasn't 2 pennies to rub together," Miss Wright added. Margaret's throat burned. They talked as if she weren't there at all, as if her heartbreak were a curiosity to pass the time until supper. She rose unsteadily, still clutching Chester. "Thomas Morrison knew exactly who I was," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "We wrote for 6 months. He valued kindness over beauty, and I'll thank you not to speak ill of a man who can no longer defend himself." The murmuring stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause. Reverend Coleman stepped forward, his black coat fluttering. "Miss Sullivan," he said gently, "I'm truly sorry for your loss. Perhaps we can find a place for you to stay until—" "She can't stay at the boarding house," someone called. "Full up!" "The hotel, then," the Reverend tried. "Not proper," Mrs. Foster snapped. "A single woman alone?" The words stung more than the wind. Margaret's head bowed. Her last coins were gone. Her only family back east wanted nothing to do with her. The letters she'd carried across the country were now just paper memories of a dead man. And then a voice from the edge of the crowd cut through the chatter. "I'll take her." Every head turned. A tall man stepped forward, leading a paint horse by the reins. His clothes were worn but clean, his shoulders broad under a faded blue work shirt. He looked like the kind of man who didn't waste words or time. "Samuel Morrison," the Reverend said, relief flooding his face. "Thomas's brother." Margaret blinked. Thomas had written of him, the brother who ran the ranch, who kept to himself, who didn't trust easily. Sam looked at her for a long moment, his eyes the color of mountain sage, unreadable. "You're the woman my brother sent for?" "I am," she managed, lifting her chin. He nodded once. "Your trunk?" Quote. "Just there," said the station master. Without another word, Samuel Morrison lifted the heavy trunk onto his shoulder as if it were nothing. He set it in the back of his wagon, turned to her and said, "You coming?" Margaret hesitated. "Where?" "My place is 12 miles out. You can stay the night, figure out what you want to do in the morning." It wasn't kindness she heard in his tone, more like duty. But it was more than anyone else had offered. She climbed into the wagon, awkwardly, her skirt snagging on the step. Sam reached up, lifted her by the waist as if she weighed no more than a child, and set her on the seat beside him. Chester scrambled up behind. The townsfolk stared as the wagon rolled away, their whispers carried on the wind. Poor Sam, saddled with her now. Did you see the size of her? The despised bride! Margaret kept her eyes on the horizon, her hands trembling in her lap. Sam drove in silence, his jaw tight, the lines of his face carved deep by wind and years. After a long while, she said softly, "You didn't have to do this." "No," he answered, "I didn't." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas wrote about you in every letter, said you could bake, sew, quote poetry, said you made him laugh. Figured the least I could do was give you a roof for one night." The mountains glowed red in the dying light as they drove on. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She'd come all this way for love and found only loss. Yet beside her sat a man whose silence spoke of his own buried sorrows. When they reached the ranch, a lonely house crouched between two ridges, Sam said simply, "You'll stay in the guest room." Supper's on the stove. He unloaded her trunk, handed her the key to the door, and disappeared into the barn without another word. Margaret stood in the yard, clutching Chester, staring at the house that smelled faintly of smoke and solitude. The sky above was vast and merciless. She had nothing left but her courage and a dog that refused to leave her side. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Margaret squared her shoulders and whispered to the wind, "You came this far, girl. You can make it one more night." Inside, a single lamp burned in the window, casting light on the first fragile piece of her new life. The wind outside the Morrison ranch sounded like a wounded animal, scraping against the wooden walls as if begging to be let in. Inside, Margaret Sullivan sat at the edge of the narrow bed in the guest room, her hands still trembling. The house smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and beneath that, something faintly lonely, a scent of silence left too long unbroken. Chester had already made himself at home, curling into a ball at her feet with a sigh that sounded almost human. Margaret ran her hand down his rough fur, whispering, "We'll be fine, boy. We just have to last the night." But the truth was, she didn't know if she could. When she finally gathered her courage and stepped into the kitchen, she found a pot of stew simmering gently on the stove. The table was bare except for two bowls, one clearly unused. Samuel Morrison sat at the far end, ledger open, pencil in hand. He didn't look up until she spoke. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "I serve myself." "I said help yourself," he replied without glancing up. She ate in silence. The stew was hearty and good, filled with chunks of beef and vegetables that reminded her of home. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find the right words. The sound of his pencil scratching against the paper filled the room like distant thunder. At last she dared to ask, "Your brother wrote about this ranch. Said you built most of it yourself." Sam looked up, his eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "Thomas talked too much." "I liked his talking," she said quietly. "His letters were kind." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or pain. He had too much kindness for a place like this. They finished their meal without another word. When Sam rose, he nodded toward the back door. "There's water in the well if you need to wash. Lock your door tonight. Coyote's been bold lately." She understood it wasn't the coyotes he was worried about. It was people, gossip, talk, a woman alone under his roof. Out here, a man's reputation could crumble faster than a barn in a storm. After he left, she washed her dishes and tidied the kitchen out of habit. Then she returned to the small room, lit the lamp, and brushed out her hair. In the mirror's dim reflection, she saw a face she barely recognized. Tired eyes, wind-burned cheeks, a sadness that had settled deep in her bones. When she lay down, Chester climbed beside her, pressing close for warmth. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender, like something a mother might have folded years ago. Margaret whispered into the stillness, "We'll be all right, somehow." But the footsteps above her told a different story, pacing, back and forth. Heavy, restless steps that went on long into the night. Samuel Morrison couldn't sleep either. Morning came pale and cold. When Margaret entered the kitchen, Sam was already there, pouring coffee. He looked as if he hadn't slept a wink. "There's breakfast if you want it," he said, though she saw only black coffee and a few biscuits on the table. "Thank you," she replied. "Is there something I can do to help?" Quote. He raised an eyebrow. "Help? I can cook, clean, mend. I'd rather work than be a burden." Sam took a slow sip of coffee, his gaze fixed on the window. "You're not staying," he said finally. "I'll take you back to town after chores. Reverend can find someone heading east." Margaret's heart clenched. "I can't go back east. I sold everything for that train ticket." "Then you'll need another plan," he said flatly, pushing back from the table. "I've got fences to mend." She watched him leave, the door closing behind him like a verdict. But Margaret Sullivan had never been one to surrender. If this rancher thought she'd be frightened off, he didn't know her yet. By noon, she'd scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed, washed the dishes, and found fresh herbs growing wild behind the house. When Sam returned, sweat streaking his temples, he stopped short in the doorway. The kitchen looked brighter, the air smelled of rosemary and soap, and there on the stove simmered a fresh pot of stew. "What's all this?" he asked. "Dinner?" Margaret said simply. "You said I'd be gone soon, but while I'm here I might as well earn my keep." He stood there for a long moment, the faintest flicker of something soft crossing his face. Then he muttered, "Suit yourself," and went to wash up. They ate together again that night, quieter but easier somehow. When Margaret served him a piece of warm bread, he surprised her by saying, "My mother used to make dumplings like that." She must have been a fine cook. "She was," he said, his voice low. "Made this place feel alive." Margaret smiled faintly. "Then I'll do my best to make it feel that way again." Sam didn't answer, but for the first time he didn't look away. The next morning, when she rose before dawn to fetch water, she found Sam already saddling his horse. The wind was sharp, carrying the promise of an early winter. "Miss Sullivan," he said, glancing over, "I thought I told you to rest." "I thought I'd bake," she replied, lifting her chin. "A man can't live on stew forever." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Suit yourself." Quote. By mid-morning, the scent of baking bread filled the house. Chester barked at dust motes while Margaret hummed softly, a habit she'd picked up when she needed courage. Sam came in from the barn, paused at the door, and listened without meaning to. For the first time in years, the house didn't sound empty. That afternoon, as he repaired a section of fence, he caught himself glancing toward the window, where a woman moved about his kitchen, as if she belonged there. He muttered under his breath, "Thomas, you fool, you might have sent for the only woman strong enough for this place." By the third day, he gave in. 3 days, he said at breakfast, his voice rough. "You can stay 3 days more. After that, we'll figure something else out." Margaret's spoon stilled halfway to her mouth. "Thank you." "It's not charity," he added quickly. "You'll cook and clean, nothing more." "I wouldn't dream of anything else," she said, hiding her small, grateful smile. But as he went out to the barn, the thought came to her. Sometimes, even a heart made of stone could soften when met with gentleness. And Samuel Morrison, whether he liked it or not, was beginning to remember what kindness felt like. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. The first snow came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains, with a fury that turned the sky gray and the air sharp as knives. Samuel Morrison had spent the morning checking fences and hauling in firewood, his breath white in the cold. When he stepped into the kitchen, the scent of baking bread and stew wrapped around him like a blanket. Margaret was standing at the table, flour dusting her hair and cheeks, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. Chester sat nearby, watching her every move with solemn interest. She looked up as Sam entered. "You're freezing," she said. "Sit by the stove. I'll fetch coffee." Quote. He wanted to protest, to remind her she wasn't his wife or his housekeeper yet, just a guest. but the warmth of her voice silenced him. He sat down without a word. When she placed the steaming mug in his hands, he noticed how her fingers trembled slightly. "You're working too hard," he said. She smiled faintly. "Hard work is better than sitting still. Sitting still makes me remember." Sam knew what she meant. He'd spent years remembering. His brother, his parents, all gone. The silence of the ranch had been his only company until she arrived with her nervous dog and that brave, determined face. That night, the wind howled and the snow began to fall. By midnight, the storm was raging full force. Sam went out to check the animals and came back soaked, his coat stiff with ice. Margaret hurried to meet him, grabbing a blanket. "You'll freeze to death out there," she scolded, wrapping it around his shoulders. He gave a short laugh. "You sound like my mother. And you sound like a man too stubborn for his own good." Quote. Their eyes met, and something warm flickered in the cold air between them. The blizzard lasted 2 full days. They burned through nearly half the firewood just to keep warm. The world outside disappeared in white silence. Inside, they talked more than they ever had. About Thomas. About her life back east. About everything they'd lost. "I thought marrying Thomas would finally make me belong somewhere," Margaret admitted one evening as the wind screamed against the windows. "Instead, I feel like a ghost wearing someone else's name." Sam looked into the fire. "Thomas believed you were the kind of woman who could survive anything." I didn't believe him. I was wrong. "You were angry when I arrived," she said softly. "I was angry before you arrived," he said. "Angry at losing him. Angry at this place. Angry at myself for not being enough to keep it all together." The firelight painted his face in shades of gold and shadow. She saw then not a hard man, but a lonely one. The kind of loneliness that eats through bone. "Sam," she said, his name strange but right on her tongue. "You've kept this place alive. That's more than enough." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time didn't see his brother's bride. Only her. That night, the cold grew worse. The wind tore a shutter loose, slamming it against the house. Sam went to fix it and sliced his palm on a splinter. When he came back inside, blood darkened the edge of his hand. "You're hurt," Margaret said, reaching for him. She guided him to the table, cleaned the cut with gentle fingers, then wrapped it carefully in cloth. He watched her face as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips parted slightly. "You've done this before," he said quietly. "I took care of my parents when they were sick. You learn what you must." When she tied off the bandage, he caught her wrist before she could pull away. Margaret. Her name on his tongue made her heart trip. The storm roared around them, but inside it was very still. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said. His voice was rough, uncertain, as if unused to softness. She tried to smile. "And you? You'd share your home with a woman the whole town calls despised?" He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Let them talk. I'm tired of their talking." He released her hand then, stepped back, and said gruffly, "Take my bed tonight." She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The storm's breaking windows upstairs. It's the only warm room." "I'll sleep on the couch." She hesitated, searching his face for mockery or pity, but found neither, only quiet resolve. "Thank you," she said finally. That night, Margaret lay under the thick quilt that smelled faintly of pine and soap, Chester curled beside her. She could hear Sam moving in the next room, pacing for a while, then the creak of the old couch as he settled. The warmth from the stove seeped into her bones, easing the ache she hadn't known she carried. She thought of how far she'd come, from the city's soot-stained streets to this wild, endless country, and of how this man, silent and scarred, had offered her shelter without asking anything in return. By morning, the world outside was white and still. The storm had passed. When Margaret stepped into the kitchen, Sam was already there, feeding the stove. His hair was mussed, his eyes heavy with sleep. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep." The quiet felt strange after the wind. He poured her coffee without asking, then sat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, she said, You don't have to send me away, Sam. I can work here. Cook, clean, whatever you need. I won't be a burden." He looked down at his coffee, then back at her. "You already make this place feel different, warmer. It's been a long time since it felt like that." "Then let me stay," she said softly. Sam's jaw tightened. "If you stay, there'll be talk." "There's talk already," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "At least this way, we'll give them something worth talking about." Quote, he studied her for a long moment, the air between them thick with something new and fragile. Finally, he nodded. "All right, stay." A smile broke across her face, small but real. "On one condition," he added, "you follow my lead. It's a working ranch, not a storybook." "I never cared for storybooks much," she said. "Real life's harder, but better." He almost smiled. "You really are nothing like I expected." "Good," she said. "I'm tired of being what people expect." Weeks later, Cedar Ridge was buzzing with gossip. The despised bride was living at the Morrison ranch, cooking for the cowboy who'd taken her in. But Margaret no longer cared. Each day she worked beside Sam, cleaning, cooking, mending, laughing sometimes when Chester chased his tail in the dust. Slowly, quietly, they built something together. One evening, as the sun bled red over the mountains, Sam paused while repairing a fence and looked toward the house. Through the window, he could see Margaret moving about the kitchen, her hair catching the last light of day. He thought of the woman who'd stepped off that train, frightened, lost, and yet unbroken, and realized she had changed everything. When he returned inside, she was waiting by the stove. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice warm. He took a seat, but his eyes stayed on her. "You belong here," he said quietly. She looked at him, surprised. "Do I?" "Yes," he said simply. "And you always will." Chester barked once, as if in agreement, and outside, the first stars began to appear over the snowy peaks. The despised bride was no longer despised. She was home. And the cowboy who'd once said, "Stay in my bed," had found something far rarer than comfort. He'd found peace.